We've noticed a change in this, haven't we?
What's important, I think, for us to really look at is consumer behavior.
That's how we react as humans. We want it fast, we want it now.
And if you're still using the same marketing tactics, the same messaging, the same approach to that consumer from 10 years ago, you're missing out.
The consumer out there is thinking, there might be a better alternative.
We've found the institutions, we've brought them together in one place. And all of a sudden, you're instantly going in with 6, 7 offers, telling the person who wants to sell their house that I have 6, 7 offers right now. Welcome back, everybody. Once again, this is the Real Estate Consumer Shift. I am Jason Wells, and we are here together, the we being...
Tim Evans. Wellesley, what's going on?
Hey,
Tell me what's happening.
We got some important stuff to discuss. I've been seeing it all over the interwebs out there, the internet.
We're going to talk a little bit about the NAR thing, but it's funny. We just came out of the eclipse. That was...
Oh, my gosh.
I got a funny story. You might have just... So my wife, she tells me last night, she said she was driving, and she's by this fairly large apartment complex coming down Chandler Boulevard there, and she said there was people standing by the apartment complex and they were looking up. And there's like several hundred people, and she thought the apartment complex was on fire as they're looking up. And she pulls over and she just, hopefully, nobody starts jumping out, but she didn't see any smoke. Right. And then it dawned on her. The eclipse.
Well, it's not everyone there. It's not every day everyone goes out and does a sun stare.
Yeah. So I know I have some good friends in Texas. They, as a big, where that was a full eclipse, I think ran up through Ohio, up and through that area. But in Texas, it was cloudy.
Oh,
so
no.
they took their whole team. There was like 36, and they went out, and it was cloudy. So
it's happening somewhere.
They just had a party anyway.
You know what probably happened? Because if some of you out there may be listening and know, they also fired up the CERN Hydro Collider.
Yes.
And so what probably happened is some people moved timelines. And so some saw it, some didn't. That's probably what happened. We're just in the timeline that it was cloudy.
Yeah, exactly. But anyways, we're here, and we've got a lot to talk about today. Let's dive into a little bit of the National Association of Realtors, as we call it, NAR. And some of you listen might be on the consumer side. If some of you are real estate side, you know what that is. But let's break that down a little bit, because there was a big a dose of information that came down a few weeks ago.
It recently, the National Association of Realtors, NAR, along with several other larger companies, real estate companies, were sued. And so there's been this lawsuit going on over the transparency, really, and how commissions are paid. And a big settlement came out. The verdict was in the billions. The settlement came out now that won't require billions, but still, several hundred million. And what I have witnessed in that time, and it's why we decided we should probably talk about this today, is a lot of total misconception. One side freaking out that, oh my gosh, buyer agents, real estate is done for, and on the other side, like, oh no, everything's fine. Nothing's changed. Everything's exactly the same. And the truth is, we need to change some, because these lawsuits that are out there, because there's a couple others that are still out there hanging around, they came about because the consumer didn't appreciate the way the industry was operating. So as an industry, we were not listening to the consumer.
So to break this down for people that are just, may not be in real estate or haven't heard about this yet, sort of break it down what happened, what the settlement, what brought that on. It was the sellers paying the fee to the buyer agent.
Ultimately what it was the plaintiffs, as it were. It wasn't a criminal case, but the people who brought the action were home sellers in Missouri, about 500 of them in this class action. And what the claim was is that they were not aware that they were also paying the buyer's agent as part of the process. Because what happens is MLS many years ago came about and said, buyers also want representation and they don't have it. So we will help that happen by the listing agent sharing their commission for the sale of the property through the MLS. Effectively is what happened. And so it gave rise to the birth of buyer agents to represent and protect the buyers. Well, now the what has come from that is you can't do that. You better not do that. Buyers, you're on your own. You got to figure this out yourself, how you're going to pay your buyer agent if you want one. And the claim from the sellers was that they would have netted more money if they didn't have to have paid the buyer agent. And that may or may not be true. It's about negotiations, but effectively that was what it was about. So it comes to transparency. The consumer not feeling like there was enough transparency in the process for them to understand how it was progressing. And so NAR has now, as part of the settlement, said that there's a lot of changes they're going to make. And why that's important is NAR has easily, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's easily 85 to 90% of all real estate agents belong to NAR.
Yeah, and so this is going to change, I think, effective about mid-July, right?
Yep,
We're going
mid-July, the settlement is supposed to go into effect if the court approves it.
Right. So it sort of reminds me like, buddies, when I was dorm life back in college, I'd go to a grocery store, and we'd see steak and lobster, and it's like, okay, you buy the steak and lobster, I got the football game. I'll put the football game on TV, and you buy the steak and lobster, and we'll share this great meal, buddies and all that, and we're watching the football game. That's sort of how it is. So it was sort of lopsided in the sense that the seller was paying for the fees, right?
Yep. It was coming out of their proceeds.
And the agent was bringing some value, bringing the buyer. But from that standpoint, when they bring the buyer, everything from the negotiation, the counter offers, the inspections, the walkthrough, if there's appraisal shortfall, everything from negotiation, I think the buyer agent, correct me if I'm wrong, was negotiating on behalf of the buyer, correct?
Correct, of course.
To help the seller or to help the buyer, not the seller. And the seller was ultimately paying for that.
Correct. And what it effectively comes down to is that they are in an adversarial process, just like the courts. And what was happening is one side, the seller side, was having to foot the bill for both the buyer and seller. Now, yes, it's been that way. I get agents are going to be out there like, well, that's how it's always been. Well, of recent time, it's always been that way. Yes. I'm not advocating whether it's good or bad on it. What we're just acknowledging is that is what was happening. As a seller, you were paying the buyer to work against your interests, get the price down lower while you wanted the price to be higher, to have terms that were favorable to their client and not favorable to you. And yes, you can negotiate win-wins and all that. I get it. But at its fundamental level, that is what was happening.
And I think that's somehow probably the reason a lot of this came about.
It is.
And how the seller was feeling like they just were not handled properly in that, and they're paying for that service.
And the buyer argues that, well, we're bringing the money, right? We're the ones who bring the money, whether it's my cash or a loan, we're bringing the money. So it's actually our money that's being used. So actually the seller, we're paying your agent with it. So it worked both ways.
Yeah. I remember getting divorced 30 years. So this is what it reminds me of getting divorced 30 years ago. And I had to, this would be like, and I hated going like to court. We were fighting over custody battles and stuff like that. And I was paying for my attorney, but that would almost be like saying, okay, I'm going to pay for my attorney's fees. And then Miss X, I'm going to pay for yours just as a courtesy. And when you're like totally at odds ends. Yeah.
Exactly.
And you're not paying for the fees and to have that kind of representation. So anyways, that's sort of what it was like. I think that's sort of, so however you feel about it, that's not what we're
saying. We're just saying this is the underlying actual mechanics that was happening.
This is what was happening. Now they've said, listen, buyer agent and buyer, you figure out your side of the equation. Seller agent, you figure out what that looks like. And then hopefully we can marry the two together. I think that's sort of where we're going with this, right?
That is exactly where we're going, where each side's going to be responsible for their own. Now, how you negotiate or work through that, it's different. But you know what? It's exactly how commercial real estate's operated.
And commercial's been, in existence for...
Since there was commercial real estate, I guess?
Yeah, since residential.
Right.
And they haven't had any problems, and they're just clicking right along, right?
So here's some of the things that came out of it. I'm gonna list off to some of the stuff that they say
and you haven't shared this
are
with
not
me,
allowed.
so I'm ready.
Right. So no longer can an MLS, because understand the majority of MLS systems out there are owned by NAR associations, whether it's your state association, a local association. So this applies to rules that NAR is now saying that MLS must operate with. No longer can you offer a co-broke, which is compensation to a buyer agent on the MLS anywhere. Currently, there's a field where you can put in there either a dollar amount or a percentage, whether it's 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5%, whatever it is you put in there, as this is what I'm offering as compensation to the buyer agent. You come and I will share my listing agent. I will share my compensation with you. That will no longer be allowed as a field. You can't write it into the text anywhere. So not even if it's semi-private remarks, private remarks, or the public remarks. You cannot talk about compensation, and don't you out there even think about getting cute about it, because they're going to be watching for it. So no, like putting up a picture of 2.5 cookies and you're like, wink, wink.
Yeah.
Right. So no talk about your co-brokes. No field can reference it on the MLS. You are allowed to put seller concessions though. So you could have the seller agree to say, well, I'm going to allow up to 3%, 4% in seller concessions.
Yeah, let's talk about this. So if the seller, let's just hypothetically, I'm pretty visual. Like I have to see these things, right? I'm a little slow, but when I see it, I can grip it. So let's say the seller wants to sweeten the pot, right? Mm-hmm. Like they're in this game and they say, I'd like to throw 10,000 out there to the agent that brings me that buyer, or I want a bonus, like sort of like what the new home builders do, right?
Yes.
We see that $10,000 bonus if you buy this home, et cetera, right?
Correct.
We see these kind of things. Is that how does that look, and is that acceptable?
For the seller to do it, yeah, as long as it's coming in as a concessions field, they can say that we're offering up to 10,000 in concessions, which is no different than actually what happens now. You'll find that they'll put in the public remarks for the MLS oftentimes that a seller willing to provide up to $10,000 in closing costs, or a carpet allowance, or these different things. These are concessions. So they're going to allow that to continue. And so putting in there like $10,000,
like a signing bonus.
What they can't say on the MLS though is that $10,000 is for compensation towards a buyer agent.
All right.
They
so that's
cannot
good to know,
say
right?
that.
Good to know. Good to understand that, folks. If you're listening.
Yep.
So, but they can put it in there as a concession. I think sellers are going to come to some points in this that they will put some things in there like that.
The interesting thing right now here in Phoenix, I encourage you to go look at your own numbers, but here in Phoenix, we're running right now so far this year between 58 and 62% of all of our closings have concessions associated with the transaction. 58 to 62%. Okay, so just call it 60%, right? 60% of all transactions have concessions. And if that's the case, that 60% of all concessions have concessions, the seller is already giving up some of their funds to help with the closing costs or whatnot. The difference is going to be in that range. The median is about $10,000 is of the concession amount. So 60% get about 10 grand. What's to note there is that money, sellers are giving it up for buyers to use towards like prepaids on their closing costs. A lot of times they're paying down points so that their interest rate is lower.
Right.
Now is going to enter in a compensation factor.
Now could that $10,000 in this example be awarded to the buyer agent, outside of the closing as compensation?
Not outside of the closing, because you can't have the closing that way. But what would happen is that you would now, whereas right now you wouldn't negotiate.
Like a seller couldn't like secretly walk behind his house and have the buyer agent write a check out to him, right? I mean, but I see these things happening.
Right. We're gonna put the bunny in a brown paper bag. We're gonna leave it by the park bench at 2:00, right?
Oh, that's gonna like how it's gonna be. Hey, look over here.
There's going to be some shenanigans stuff that comes up. And I would expect, though, that all the associations are going to be watching that pretty heavily.
Yeah, it's going to be. So, and the other part is you can wrap it into the closing, right? But then here's where some of that issue comes is appraisal. That value's coming up. We get into a softer market. How, if those concessions are coming out to pay for buyer agency fees, right?
Yep.
As a concession, you run into that risk of it as well. So the agent's really sharp at negotiating how to work this buyer. That's where this is
Yep.
You have to get with that buyer and figure this out.
You have to start having the uncomfortable conversations that you don't want to have right now. Because from a seller standpoint, what changes from the seller or for a listing, you can't advertise a co-broke on the MLS. You can say, I'm giving concessions about it, and you cannot advertise it through the MLS at all. You can put it on your own website. So I can put it, if I'm listing a property, I can put on my website that the seller is in fact offering however much as compensation to the buyer agent. I can do that on my website off MLS. Now for the buyer, because the buyer and the buyer agent cannot open a door, not even open a door for a buyer. So you buyers out there, unless you have a signed buyer broker with an agent, they can't even open the door for you. So you have to sign an employment agreement even to get a door opened, let alone negotiate, submit a contract, all that kind of stuff. A buyer broker must have clear percentage or dollar amount. It must be definitive what the amount of compensation is. And it cannot have an offset, meaning you can't say, I'm going to charge 4% as my buyer agent fee, but I will reduce that or take whatever a seller is offering. So if a seller's offering 2.5%, I will agree to just 2.5% instead of my 4%. You cannot do that. It is one amount and that's it. They will not allow you to have any equivocation in it. It's a set fee because of this need to have the transparency that they're saying. That's going to be problematic. It's one hand 100%. Good for consumers because, okay, now I know what's I'm going to have to pay. But here's what I see happening for consumers, Tim, on the buy side is that FHA and VA only already have certain allowances. Even conventional only allows some allowances of up to like 3% concessions.
It's very tight. Yeah.
So if we have 62% of all closings are having up to $10,000 in concessions, our median purchase price here is about $450. That means a 3% concession would be about $12,000. They're eating up the whole thing already. So that's going to have to loosen up. Additionally, as a buyer, it now becomes a material issue. If I don't have the additional cash to pay my buyer agent,
think of your first-time home buyer, veterans,
right?
People that are have the great credit, but can't, they're a little bit cash poor on that side of it.
Now, part of their material criteria, just as important as having 4 bedrooms and 3 baths, is that at least 2% be offered by the seller. And so this is going to create some interesting situations where previously and it will remain such that our fiduciary is to not allow our compensation to get in the way of the transaction occurring. The way this will change it is we will now also have a duty of abeyance. And that duty of abeyance that we've always had will include, don't show me any houses unless the seller is at least offering 2%.
Yeah.
And so now your compensation is not getting in the way. You're being directed by the buyer that's the case.
Let me throw you a curveball, Jason.
Throw it away.
All right. I'm going to ask you this question. What if you weren't a NAR? This is NAR.
Okay.
Let's just say, there's a shift and there's something going on outside that happens that we don't even know about right now. Like it's out in the future, and it's something different than NAR, and you're not an NAR agent. What does that look like?
If you're not a NAR agent, if your brokerage is not affiliated with the National Association of Realtors or your local board or anything, you're not bound by the requirements that the settlement will put in as far as how your business will be done. But, and yes, this is a big but, you better follow those same guidelines because it's the consumer who has said, this is what we want. And the law is going to adapt to that. And the whole reason the court and lawsuit came down the way they did is because they said the real estate industry cannot keep operating this way. You have to change. So if you're not a member,
even though you think you might be able to sidestep this, right. And go a different direction, and this is good to
you're just opening yourself up for a suit.
Because as you've been an attorney understand that there's already been law and it's established as case law now, right?
Yep.
It has been tried, and
so we have precedent. Tested. We have case law. Yes, it was going to be appealed, but it didn't get appealed.
It got settled.
So we have case precedent that says real estate industry, you cannot do this.
Right. So if you're thinking like, okay, let's shift here and do something different, but still offer a co-broke, still offer this, you have these cases that could eventually.
Well, they'll find their way to you.
Find your way at some point in time.
Yep. There actually, as part of this settlement, there are non-NAR MLSs that joined NAR in the settlement so that they would not later be sued.
Very interesting. So there you go. Boy, that's quite interesting. So it's a lot on the table. Good stuff.
It is. And the thing about it is it creates opportunity.
It does.
If we're interested in what the consumer wants, we recognize the opportunity to serve them at a better level. We listen to them. We don't tell them how it's going to work. We are actively asking the consumer, how do you want this to work? Because it was our not listening to them in the first place that got us sued as an industry. So we better listen to them this time around. And that's why we talk so much about this in the Real Estate Consumer Shift.
That's right. Great podcast. Jason, I'm looking forward to next week, but this is a great summit. Hey, check us out on the Real Estate Consumer Shift. We have many different consumer podcasts
topics that we've talked about, right?
Yeah, and our multiple cash offer system, which delivers all the certainty, convenience to consumers at a snap of a finger, that agents are taking wonderful advantage of, and we're helping hundreds of agents out there. So we look forward to seeing you back here next week.
Next week, smash that subscribe, like button, hit the follow us, do all the things on social media. We'll see you next time.
You got it. Goodbye.